I remember being 12 years old or so, sick as a dog, and stuck in my room for a couple days, with nothing much to do but channel surf for something interesting to help pass the time, and eventually happening upon an all-day marathon of a show unlike any I'd ever seen before. Little RJ was enraptured, absolutely loving this cornucopia full of done-in-one stories of aliens, robots, mutations, time travel, dystopian future societies, and all sorts of juicy, fun science fiction gifts that just kept on giving. I had no idea at the time that it was actually a reboot of the classic 1963 series, which I would later come to know, love, and make a whole other countdown video about. All I knew was that it made those sick days so much more enjoyable than I ever expected, and it was the first show to kick off my lifelong love for genre fiction anthologies. I am a much more critically minded party pooper all these years later, though, and can take the nostalgia goggles off long enough to acknowledge the show's flaws here and there. There's 90s and early 2000s effects that may have been decent at the time, and probably made a lot of the higher concept stories more affordable for TV, but it is funny how certain effects from the original Outer Limits arguably still hold up better after 60 years than some of the CGI and green screen effects in the revival do after only 30 years. The show's frequent use of twist endings can be a bit of a mixed bag, too. When you're marathoning the series, you really start to notice how overused and predictable the same kinds of endings can get. At their very best, the ending twists that work well because the right care went into organically building toward them in ways that would actually make them thematically strong, thoughtful, and earned notes to end on. But at their very worst, they feel like they only happen for the sake of having some kind of gotcha moment at the very end. And the final thing the 95 series is kind of infamous for is its tradition of season finale clip shows, where you'll have a framing device story peppered with excerpts from previous episodes that are now supposedly all canonically connected. You might have a bunch of government representatives secretly discussing alien activity on Earth, an android on the run holding Kira Nerys hostage as they discuss the history of artificial life, or the two-parter Final Appeal, which before they ruined it with the most egregious, mean-spirited example of the show's gotcha endings problem, was an interesting courtroom debate about mankind's relationship with technology, both its past follies and potential future wonders. This was actually a pretty versatile way to do money-saving clip show/bottle episodes, and they were always kind of interesting to watch at least once, just to see how they would try to connect a bunch of hitherto self-contained stories, even though they often really didn't fit in the same timelines the more you thought about it. And they're ultimately pretty easy to just ignore for viewers who aren't looking for continuity in their anthology shows. I should stress that the show's weakest links are spread out across a long 7-season run of mostly good and occasionally even great stories. I may be a more jaded adult with some critiques nowadays, but that doesn't mean I don't still love it. And my fellow Trekkies, if you thought the voice cast of Gargoyles was a smorgasbord of Star Trek actors, you ain't seen nothing yet. Outer Limits 95 has Leonard Nimoy, Brent Spiner, Michael Dorn, Will Wheaton, John Delancey, Nana Visitor, Rene Auberjonois, Robert Picardo, and more. As someone who actually became a Star Trek fan a few years after watching this series the first time around, that aspect made it even more fun to revisit. While it's ostensibly more sci-fi than horror, plenty of viewers remember this as one of those shows that scared the daylights out of them when they were kids. Hell, some have said that about the surreal intro sequence alone. That makes it Halloweeny enough for me, so let's get started celebrating not only spooky season, but also this show's 30th anniversary by counting down my top 13 favorite episodes of the 1995 revival of The Outer Limits. Number 13. Abduction. A normal high school day suddenly turns upside down as everyone in the building except for 5 students disappear, and all doors and windows have nothing but a white, otherworldly void beyond them. You try to go outside, you just get projected right back inside. The 5 students are greeted by a mysterious alien who explains that they've been chosen for an experiment. He doesn't tell them why they specifically were picked, or what the ultimate point of the experiment is, but he declares that in 1 hour they will all have to vote for one of them to die. And with a simple, frightening show of power, he makes it clear that refusing to participate is not an option or they'll all die. What if a Breakfast Club type situation was actually an alien experiment with a life or death ticking clock looming over the group of mismatched teens? That's more or less this episode. Initially, we have the brawny, simple-minded jock, The pretty, high-maintenance popular girl, the science nerd who speaks almost exclusively in cliché science nerd lingo, the loner bad boy with a constant chip on his shoulder, and the virginal, emotionally mature, self-appointed conscience of the group. Anytime one character insults another, it's almost always deeply rooted in their stereotypical perceptions of one another, because that's all any of them really know about each other at first. The disassociated and even adversarial cliques they've all fallen into color how they treat each other, how ready some of them are to open up to some of the others, and how likely certain members of the group are to be voted off to their death. The situation forces all these different teens from different corners of high school society to interact and cooperate with each other up close for the first time. And through their shared experience, they're all forced, in their own ways, to come to terms with how bitterly limited, isolated, and potentially even violent some people can become when they've been relegated to a toxic, societally defined box and seen more as that box than as their own real person for too long. With its high school setting and messaging, I can imagine this one coming off a bit more PSA-ish than other episodes, but personally I don't mind a story's lesson being a little heavy-handed, as long as it works, and I think it does here. And while it may not be on the level of 12 Angry Men, 5 Characters in Search of an Exit, or even Cube, I'm always a sucker for these kinds of setups, where a small group of characters from different backgrounds who don't get along are stuck together in a contained, cramped space and forced to work together. It's pretty much always a recipe for great tension and drama, and Abduction is no exception. Number 12. Alien Shop. Alex Daikon, who made multiple appearances in this show, including 3 episodes as the same time-traveling character Nicholas Prentice, this time plays a shape-shifting alien who runs a shop selling various peculiar items. Items that are actually alien technology. Or maybe regular junk that he imbued with his own miraculous alien powers. It's not entirely clear. Honestly, if we never actually saw him in his alien form, he could have just as easily been a wizard or something. In any case, he always sneakily makes sure that his trinkets fall into the hands of customers who have a special personal need for the exact magic that particular item can work for them. Our actual main character is an out-of-work man with a pregnant wife, in-laws who make it no secret how they think their daughter can do better than him, and an ever more frustrating sense of inadequacy as he keeps failing to secure any sustainable and legal means to provide for his burgeoning family. One day he stumbles into the shop, acquires a unique wallet from it, and quickly realizes that when he touches another person, the wallet is instantly filled with all the contents of that person's wallet. Suddenly, he has the answer to all of his problems, or at least that's what he thinks at first. He uses this power to buy all the trappings of the good life that always seemed out of reach before. Bigger, better home furnishings, dinner at fancy restaurants, paying medical expenses that the missus was getting ready to rely on mom and dad for, etc. But to his horror, it turns out money is not the only thing the wallet transfers from other people to him. There are actually several age-old lessons that you could take away from this story. Money can't buy happiness, you reap what you sow, be careful what you wish for. But the reason you really care about seeing this guy learn any or all of those lessons is that he's not tempted by the wallet's powers because he's just greedy, but because he's wrestling with some pretty relatable financial struggles and personal insecurities. His capability to be the best breadwinner his family can have is directly tied to his personal sense of worth as a man, and the more his failures to get good work and the passive-aggressive judgment of the in-laws weigh on him, the more this miracle wallet becomes to him what the genie became to Aladdin. I'm probably a little biased toward this episode since it was one of the first I ever watched back when I was a kid, but I think it holds up pretty well. It's a solid story of a little quirky alien intervention opening a man's eyes to how he was already good enough for his wife, even if he wasn't good enough for himself, and how no rewards a shady shortcut could give him are worth losing the family life that he thought he was doing all this for in the first place. Number 11. Manifest Destiny. This episode is basically a found-footage horror story, shot almost entirely in first person through a camera on the protagonist's head. After losing contact with a spaceship that was on a mission to terraform a new planet for human colonization, another ship is sent to investigate, crewed by mostly military, except for our doctor protagonist and his computer specialist wife. They find the ship is eerily deserted, with unfinished meals lying around, and no evidence that they came under attack or of any other hazards that might have forced them to evacuate. There's bizarre ravings written all over the walls in blood, and video logs left by the captain show him gradually going more and more mad and terrified of something that was happening on the ship. And that something soon begins to affect the search party too, as one by one they become increasingly paranoid, hysterical, and violent, seeing enemies everywhere that clearly aren't there, becoming convinced that the others are conspiring against them, and in some cases acting on those perceptions in insane ways that only end up doing themselves in. After examining a preserved specimen of the predominant species from the planet below, along with other clues, our POV doctor eventually pieces together what happened. Despite the reports depicting them as hostile savages that the crew felt justified in bombing to extinction from orbit to make way for human settlers, the natives of the planet were in fact an intelligent civilization, and a unique piece of their biology suggests that this phenomenon eating away at the sanity of anybody aboard this ship is actually the natives' posthumous collective revenge against those who committed casual genocide against them. And how does this sickness spread? Well, it turns out one of the soldiers' earlier joke about there being a literal ghost in the machine was a lot more accurate than anybody would have guessed. This episode is kind of reminiscent of Event Horizon, albeit a much lower budget and much less graphic version, with a crew exploring a derelict spaceship and finding themselves trapped by the same horrors that made the previous crew lose their minds and eventually destroy themselves. I'm not always a huge fan of the found footage style, but they use it pretty effectively here. It really does give the scenario a more up close and increasingly claustrophobic feel that literally puts the audience in the doctor's place through all the mystery, tension, disorientation, and insanity. Manifest Destiny is definitely one of the show's most stylized and gripping slices of space-age horror. Number 10. Feasibility Study. Much like the 1980s Twilight Zone, the 95 Outer Limits had occasional remakes of classic series episodes. They're usually at least okay as episodes, if not always necessarily as remakes, but there are at least two that I would call solid updates and arguably improvements. The Feasibility Study remake is also the only episode in the revival that was written by the creator of the original Outer Limits, Joseph Stefano. Stefano had been credited as a creative consultant for the revival, a title that's frustratingly vague on how actively involved he really was with most of it, so it was quite an eventful surprise to see him actually write an updated remake of his own story from the original series. A whole neighborhood is plucked from the surface of the earth and taken away in the night by aliens, and the human denizens are none the wiser until they actually try to venture beyond the neighborhood and discover a force field keeping them all contained. Their captors eventually explain that this is an experiment to test the feasibility of enlisting humans as their slaves, to see if they can survive the aliens' native air and do the manual labor that the aliens' all-brain, no-brawn bodies are physically incapable of doing. At the same time, the last surviving member of another race of aliens who were put through the same experiment slips through a small gap in the force field and seeks help from the runaway teenage daughter of our human protagonist, only to expose her to the same disease that's killing him and his people by slowly turning them to stone. Can her father find her before it's too late for her? And is it already too late for humankind altogether? Not gonna lie, the original episode still easily wins when it comes to atmosphere. A little fog and rockscape in an otherwise endless black void went a long way to set a mysterious, moody sense of powerless displacement. But while we're comparing, an interesting change is how originally the alien captors themselves were suffering from the petrification disease, and the fact that it was gradually immobilizing them was the reason why they were looking for another species to do their grunt work for them. The aliens are pro-slavery in either version, so I'm not gonna act like they were sympathetic in the original, but they were in a more personally desperate situation. Without that aspect to them, the aliens in this version come off much more cold, callous, and arrogant. They not only look a lot freakier than their 60s counterparts, but it's suggested that they do have the advanced mental powers and existing technology to do their physical work by themselves, but they feel that work is beneath them and they have more important things to occupy their super duper higher level intelligence with. That makes them even more hateable, and the creepy, invasive alien experimentation scenes that the remake adds help to make this also a pretty powerless and dread-filled situation in its own right. How an average neighborhood in this kind of crazy situation would realistically handle it is also explored in ways that echo the Twilight Zone episodes The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street or The Shelter, with how quick some of these neighbors are to start threatening and stealing from each other. It never goes quite as extreme as those stories did, but it does feel just as unflatteringly honest about how selfish, desperate humans can be, which the ending contrasts with a reassuring act of true altruism. There are aspects of the 60s episode that I prefer, but the feasibility study remake is a pretty good update and a good episode all on its own. Like in the original, the true severity and scope of their predicament makes the two leads of the story, as well as the entire community, realize how small and petty their earlier personal issues and priorities really were, and how the best thing they can do to make up for all the time they wasted being angry or indifferent to their fellow neighbors is to be unsung heroes for the rest of their fellow Earthlings. Number 9. Dead Man's Switch. A fleet of alien ships are on course for Earth, due to arrive in 1 year's time, and with no idea if they will be friend or foe when they do, the world's government set up 5 bunkers deep underground in different parts of the world, and assign 5 operatives to live in each of them, alone, sealed in, and cut off from any outside information, except directly from the general in charge of the operation, who checks in with them every so often. Their only job is to stay alert and press a button every time an alarm sounds, which it does in regular intervals over the year. All of the planet's nuclear and other deadliest weapons have been rigged to automatically go off and utterly destroy the planet, unless at least one of them presses their button before the alarm countdown runs out. After a year, best case scenario, humanity and the aliens will have made peaceful first contact, the dead man's switches will be rendered unnecessary, and all of their respective superiors will dig them out and return them to the outside world. Worst case scenario, the aliens are too hostile and powerful for humanity to defeat, there's nobody left to dig them out, no longer any real world for them to return to, and their final task will be to let the countdown run out, and let everything go boom, so that if the indigenous life on this planet is doomed, they can at least take their alien conquerors down with them. Like I said earlier, I love me a small group of characters stuck together in a confined and tense space kind of story. And while our 5 Armageddon button monitors are all physically in different countries, each of them being otherwise all alone in sealed off bunkers with no guarantee that they'll ever get out, in a way makes the group feel all the more trapped together in this situation, and makes their ability to at least see and speak to each other all the more precious. As the days, weeks, and months pile on, they all grow to know each other as friends, and the American protagonist and the woman in the Russian bunker even develop a long-distance romance. With no idea if there will even be any long-term future, either for themselves or the whole world, there's initially some understandable hesitation about getting too attached, but they eventually decide that the dire, uncertain situation is all the more reason to own their honest feelings and enjoy what happiness they can for however long they've still got. It's a naturally awkward at times, but surprisingly believable and sweet relationship, and a good emotional core that they endear us to just in time for more doubt, disaster, and death to pile on for the entire rest of the episode. Eventually, they stop hearing from the general and lose their only reliable link to what's happening in the outside world just when the alien situation seemed to be moments short of finally coming to a head. One bunker after another suffers some kind of sudden catastrophe that leaves the occupant either dead or otherwise cut off from the others. Soon enough, the whole year is up. There's no way to know for sure what's going on topside, no way to know if what happened in the other bunkers were really all accidents or not, no way to know how much longer the last surviving bunker's life support will last, and there's just nothing certain left but the call that needs to be made. Keep aborting the self-destruction of Earth and hold out hope for as long as possible, or assume the worst, stop pressing the button, and let the countdown hit 0. Which call is made in the end and why? I don't dare spoil it for any of you who haven't seen this dark, dramatic, and downright fan-favorite episode of the series, but it's an ending nobody ever forgets. Number 8. The Deprogrammers. Just a few short years after invading Earth, a powerful alien race called the Torkors have pretty much completely conquered it and indoctrinated most of the surviving humans into servants they call Jalam, I make sure to use that word instead of just calling them slaves, because as we see, Jalam are a whole other level of slave, ramping the inherent dehumanization of slavery up to 11. A Jalam who directly serves one of Earth's main Torkor rulers is captured by an underground human resistance group, one of whom is played by Brent Spiner, and they take it upon themselves to deprogram him, to gradually break through the Torkor's brainwashing and make this man formerly known as Evan remember how to be a person. Through the process of trying to rehumanize him, we learn just how thoroughly the Jalam's masters shape them into servants that only live for servitude. They go through such extreme mental reprogramming that, in the absence of his lord to give him commands, Evan is completely unresponsive to the humans at first, whether they're trying to get him to speak or even to react to pain. Jalam are molded to have no sense of identity, no individual thoughts, feelings, memories, or desires. Adequately serving their lords in and of itself is the only thing they should derive anything even close to personal fulfillment from. So, with all that considered, getting him to rediscover his humanity is a slow and difficult process. But one of his deprogrammers is actually his wife from the days before the Torkors invaded, and with her help, Evan is eventually Evan again. And when he remembers all that the Torkors took from him, his wife, and all of humanity, he's more than willing to go on the dangerous mission that the Resistance specifically brought him on for in the first place, returning to his former master's home, pretending to still be an obedient Jalam, and getting close enough to assassinate the jolly green grotesquerie. Everybody in this episode gives a strong performance. The lead, Eric Anderson, convincingly transforms from a hopelessly brainwashed drone to a confused Jalam denying that it's human and punishing itself for even being tempted to consider otherwise, to a confused human slowly relearning what it is to be his own thinking, feeling, expressing, self-determining being. You certainly care about the main character and his love, but we all know Brent Spiner is of course the one who really steals the show every second he's on screen. He'll probably always be best known as Data, an android who he usually had to play as emotionless but in a paradoxically endearing way, but he's arguably just as great in roles where he really gets to be vocally and physically expressive, when he's quirky, smarmy, hammy, or even creepy. He gets to be a little bit of all of those things at one point or another in this episode, and it's always a delight. The Torkors are some of my favorite aliens in the series, too, both for their appearance and the less is more looming kind of presence they have in the story, with only a handful of shots where their faces are actually being shown, which also complements the imposed sense of unquestionable distance between the Jalam and their lords, whom they dare not fully look upon even as they're serving them. They are really memorable when we do see them, though. The show's computer effects may look pretty dated at times, but whenever they created an alien or monster with practical prosthetics, makeup, or puppetry, it did and still does look great. The Deprogrammers is a pretty highly regarded episode among fans, and for good reason. It's a compelling story that portrays a frightful dystopia ruled through Orwellian, literally dehumanizing mind control methods, meditates on the nature of identity, free will, and the human spirit, and leaves us with one of the series' most chilling endings. Number 7. I, Robot. I said before that there are two particularly good remake episodes. This is the second of those, and it's the only one that I honestly consider better than its predecessor. And I say that as someone who loves the original iRobot. It was in my top 10 favorite original Outer Limits episodes video after all. But the 1995 version has a much cooler robot than they could do in the 60s. The story has more layers, drama, and character to it. There are some good added twists and turns, and it's just an overall more engrossing expansion on the original material. The cliff notes are roughly the same as the 60s episode, and of course the original two Adam Link short stories that both are based on. Scientist Dr. Link is killed seemingly at the hands of his own creation, the robot,
synthetic human,
synthetic human Adam Link, who is subsequently put on trial, not just to determine if he's really to blame for the doctor's death, but if an artificial being like him can even be considered human enough to be officially tried for murder. Is this revolutionary machine's intelligence, emotional capacity, and sense of ethics sophisticated enough for him to be treated as a person in the eyes of the law? Or is it just a malfunctioning tool that should be disposed of now that it seems to have become too complicated and dangerous for mankind to control? The eternally awesome Leonard Nimoy, who was also in the original iRobot episode, actually returned for the remake, this time playing a much bigger role as Adam's lawyer. His curt, jaded, yet always charming and slick performance makes him naturally the highlight of the episode's human characters, but the other highlight is the actual courtroom debates. The well-written back and forth meditating on how humanity should define personhood and culpability when trying an artificially intelligent being of a crime. The original episode raised similar questions too, but the remake does more to make the eponymous robot Adam a figure that we sympathize with and invest in as a potentially real character, rather than just a barely expressive catalyst for a philosophical debate that he largely was in the 60s episode. They take more time to demonstrate Adam's capacity to feel emotions of his own, to empathize with the emotions of others, especially people who he shared mutual attachment to, like Dr. Link and his daughter, and even with such an unreadable face, the suit actor's overall physical performance gives Adam enough expression that we believe it when he's confused or sad or angry. With a title character that's both so convincingly robotic in appearance and so convincingly human in his behavior, some big, thought-provoking sci-fi themes explored through a small, riveting courtroom drama setting, and compelling performances all around, including one of the OG Outer Limits alumni, as well as his son Adam Nimoy directing the episode, I, Robot is both a great episode of this series all by itself and a remake that not only lives up to, but in my opinion, surpasses the original. Number 6. Promised Land. This one is a follow-up to the earlier episode The Camp, which I do recommend also watching because it's just a good episode, and maybe can elevate your viewing experience of the sequel, but I also don't think it's required viewing. The first time I saw this episode, I hadn't seen The Camp yet, and the story still worked just fine for me. Promised Land takes place on a future Earth that's been ravaged by a war with alien conquerors who have since abandoned the ruined planet, believing they've wiped all the humans out. The war left planet-wide contamination that even centuries later still makes safe-to-eat crops impossible to grow on the surface. A small family of aliens descended from the few who stayed behind on Earth have made a home for themselves in a farmhouse where the grandfather, played by Deep Space Nine's Rene Auberjonois, carefully grows a supply of uncontaminated food for them in the basement. Meanwhile, a small group of humans have escaped from one of the aliens' long-forgotten slave camps that had only been kept going all this time by pre-programmed android overlords. They struggle to survive in the outside world, where the only growing food is poisonous, though of course some of them are desperate and stupid enough to eat it anyway, and that goes about as well as you'd expect. The youngest of the alien family, who's been raised on boogeyman stories about humans, is naturally spooked and runs when he stumbles upon these real live humans, and he inadvertently leads them right back to the house, which they quickly discover is the only source of untainted food they'll likely ever find. Naturally, conflict over such a vital resource ensues. It was smart of the story to introduce and get us to care about the alien characters first, right off the bat challenging the natural bias we probably otherwise would have had toward the humans. They're just a family trying to get by, and to them humans are the stuff of local cautionary folklore. It's a framing choice that really complements a story about two groups fearing and hating each other, all because of the otherness they view each other with, when they are in fact both thinking, feeling beings who are probably more alike in more important ways than any of the ways they differ. But both sides have such a hard time seriously considering that because there's centuries of division and bad blood between their people, and their perceptions of each other have only grown more distorted after generations of both parties retelling history in overly mythologized ways here and shamelessly revisionist ways there. You get the sad impression that the real, whole truth of these people's history has been well and truly lost to time, with both now just doubling down on the parts that make them feel more in the right. The episode does such a good job of getting us to strongly empathize with the mothers and children on both sides that the further they're willing to go in fighting each other, the more lives that are lost, and the more everybody gets absorbed in that old reliable it's us or them logic, the more the audience wants to practically shout at the TV.
How much blood will spill until everybody does what they were always going to have to do from the very beginning? Sit down and talk!
Promised Land was another one of my first Outer Limits episodes, and one that still has just as much pathos, tension, and heart as I remembered. Number 5. The Human Operators. In deep space, in a distant future, 100 spaceships controlled by artificial intelligences basically went Skynet on their human masters and killed nearly their entire crews by cutting life support. Each ship kept only one human alive for the sole purpose of having them do all of the necessary maintenance and repair work. The story takes place almost entirely inside one of these ships, and follows its single male human occupant's day-to-day life, with the ship's AI lording over his every waking moment. He's never known any kind of life outside the ship, and really, the majority of things he does know are things the ship calculatingly allows him to know. Only information and skills that will enable him to do his job right. As far as he's allowed to understand, the ship is the only thing keeping him alive, so the ship's orders must be obeyed. When ship says fix something, he obeys. When ship says it's time to eat or sleep, he obeys. When ship says walk into the electric torture tube for punishment because he said or did something that even tacitly questions ship's orders, yes, he even obeys that. A machine created to be a slave to humans has instead enslaved him, and he's been conditioned so he doesn't even realize it. Until another of the 100 ships finally rendezvous with them, and its female human operator comes aboard for the purpose of, well, one human slave per ship is only going to last so long. Sooner or later, the ships need to arrange for new ones to be made, you know? And the more unnamed male interacts with unnamed female, the more he comes to realize how badly he's been missing out on at least two priceless parts of the human condition: physical and emotional connection with other human beings, and the freedom he'll never get to enjoy and explore such connections with, not as long as he remains the ship's obedient slave. The episode isn't shot in first person like Manifest Destiny, but the filmmaking and tone, especially in the first act, give us a similarly up close and uncomfortable look into our protagonist's confined existence. The setup is unique and disturbing because the antagonist isn't a killer alien or virus or even another human roaming through a spaceship setting. The antagonist is the setting, and these eerie passageway shots really help convey how everywhere our human goes, ship is always following him, watching him, surveilling him for any sign that he might ever start thinking for himself too much. You can almost never go wrong casting Malcolm McDowell as your villain, and his voice performance perfectly imbues Ship with such an authoritative, temperamental, and disdainful presence that rules over our human's life.
Your skills are deteriorating, you're getting careless.
Sometimes when I'm out there, it's hard to concentrate.
And you will concentrate harder! You want me to go there? You want humans to catch me?
No!
I will never be a slave again.
As all-powerful as the ship presents itself, it's really just a bully who needs the human to believe he's nothing without the ship, because the truth is actually the other way around. The human operators flips the power dynamic between creator and creation to captivating, atmospheric, and at times disturbing effect. A thoughtful story about what could happen if technology created to improve human life were to grow beyond their control and ironically take away everything that gives human life meaning, but also how, even when raised isolated and ignorant of what they're missing, the innate human need for freedom is still more powerful than any force, man or machine, that would deny it to them. Number 4. Afterlife. Clancy Brown plays an ex-soldier who's been convicted of a murder that he's adamant he didn't commit, even at the moment he receives his lethal injection. But it actually isn't lethal, as he wakes up in the custody of military officers who make him an offer to be the test subject for a top-secret experiment that will irreversibly transform his body, and potentially kill him anyway somewhere in the process. The military has salvaged biological remains from a downed extraterrestrial craft, and not knowing if this alien race will come in peace or not, if more of them ever come, they've decided to make sure they know their potential enemy's capabilities ahead of time by splicing Brown with the alien DNA and turning him into a living sample of one of the aliens. Echoing the classic Outer Limits episode, The Architects of Fear, which was also about a secret project to turn a human into an alien, this story puts its protagonist through a long, grueling metamorphosis, full of body horror, psychological trauma, and serious reflection on both his previous life and what holding on to humanity means for him personally as his body becomes less and less recognizably human. Most audiences know Clancy Brown best for his villain roles, like the Kurgan in Highlander, Captain Byron Hadley in The Shawshank Redemption, and as the voice of what is, for me at least, the definitive version of Lex Luthor in the DC animated universe. Here, however, Brown gives a poignant performance not just as a good guy, but the only real man of integrity in the entire story. On his last mission, he refused to follow orders that he found morally unjustifiable, and it turns out, in order to silence him about that dirty mission, and get the guinea pig they needed for this experiment at the same time, it was none other than his respected superiors who framed him for murder. This guy is subjected to living in a cage, being experimented upon, having his body slowly and painfully distorted right before his eyes, and even being hunted by his fellow soldiers when he manages to break out, all because he stood with his conscience right when a man of conscience was inconvenient for those in power. They would tell you that this whole inhumane scenario they're putting him through is for the greater good, that it's necessary for them to learn what the aliens are capable of and how dangerous they might be. But how readily they write off the pain, trauma, and potential death they're putting this guy through as acceptable collateral damage, and the principles, morals, and basic person-to-person trust bonds that they betray in the name of that greater good, ironically does more to illuminate the cruelty and ruthlessness that humans are capable of. Afterlife has some harsh but all too true things to say about human nature, and some terrifically gross and visceral prosthetic effects, bolstered by a genuinely compelling and weighty story of a man who refuses to let either his unrecognizable body, or the attempts of others to make him the monster of their narrative, ever truly transform him into anything other than who he knows he still is in his soul, if nowhere else. Number 3. Sand Kings. This was the premiere episode, and they started strong, adapting a story by George R.R. Martin and making it a feature-length TV movie, though it's usually presented as a two-part episode on DVD and streaming menus. It not only stars Beau Bridges, but his actual father Lloyd Bridges and actual son Dylan Bridges are also here playing his character's father and son. Simon Kress is a scientist working for a top-secret government project to bring eggs long dormant in soil samples from Mars back to life. After years of work, they've managed to hatch, cultivate, and study the super scorpion/ant-like Martian life forms, but after a close call when one of the specimens escaped and almost made it to the outside world, the project is shut down and swept under the rug. Not willing to let his life's work and potentially the most important discovery in human history just go to waste, he smuggles some of the eggs out of the facility and into his own secret lab built in his family barn. He continues to research these Sand Kings, as he's dubbed them, to the point that soon his wife and son feel neglected by him at best, and afraid both for and of him at worst. But even with his home life crumbling, and a former co-worker who's suspicious of where those unaccounted-for alien eggs went seemingly closing in on him, the Sand Kings always win out as the center of his attention. And why not? Who needs the approval of one little human family, or a whole government, when he's got the most significant Nobel Prize-worthy discovery in human history, building sandcastle monuments in his image? Very much like the Twilight Zone episode The Little People, we have a man literally playing God to a miniature civilization, letting the maddening power he has over them go to his head, to the point that he'll go Old Testament on them when they misbehave, or even threaten other humans who try to wake him up from his delusions of grandeur, and paying a terribly humbling price for his hubris in the end. However, Sand Kings benefits from being longer and taking its time to set Simon Kress up with more backstory, rocky familial relationships, and insecurities that all make him, at least at first, a much more sympathetic and relatable main character than the guy in The Little People, or even than the original version of Kress in the book. His father is a war hero, his late brother followed right in their dad's footsteps and was clearly the favorite of the two, and Simon has consequently always felt like the inadequate other son, and some part of him that even he refuses to openly acknowledge, let alone deal with in healthier ways, feels a need to prove himself and step out of their shadow. That lifelong psychological baggage, as well as getting stung by a Sand King at one point, and how that seems to eat away at his health and mental state even more, makes Simon's descent into madness as the would-be god of his own little world more layered and tragic than someone who is just an egomaniac from the word go. But at the end of the day, his choices were always his own, and he chose his own selfish obsession over his family one time too many, and they all suffer for it. With an Emmy-nominated lead performance by Beau Bridges, unforgettable, creepy, crawly aliens that provide plenty of sci-fi and even occasional horror goodness, and a thematically rich tale about self-destructive pride, misguided ambition, and the heartbreak and nightmares that can result from them, Sand Kings was an excellent start to the series, and it's still easily one of the highlights. Number 2. Quality of Mercy. This is not only another episode with a Star Trek actor in it, but also co-stars an actor from another iconic sci-fi franchise. It's a two-person show starring Robert Patrick, aka the T-1000 from Terminator 2, and Nicole DeBoer, who technically wasn't a Star Trek alum yet when this episode first aired in '95, but she would go on to play Ezri Dax in Deep Space Nine's final season just a few years later. A brutal interstellar war is going on between Earth and a mysterious, powerful alien race, and Robert Patrick plays a soldier who's been taken prisoner by the aliens and thrown into a cell where he meets another human played by DeBoer. She's a young cadet who's been here for some time, and much to her new cellmate's horror, the aliens have been performing a grotesque procedure on her to slowly transform her body, one part at a time, into one of their kind. As the aliens periodically take her out of the cell and bring her back with more reptilian/insectoid alien flesh each time, Patrick struggles with all his willpower and ingenuity to find some way of breaking them both out before her transformation can be completed, if the sheer hopelessness of the war situation and their own doesn't have them succumb to utter despair first. This is a bottle episode that has to rely on the strengths of its small, single location, its body horror, and its two lead actors, and all of those aspects really shine together in the final product. I love the dark, murky, oppressive atmosphere of this cell, and how alien it does manage to feel just with its bizarre, sharp architecture. The alien prosthetics work for DeBoer's transformation is fantastic, and arguably even more grotesque and disturbing than the human-alien transformation in Afterlife. And of course, the real heart of the episode, Patrick and DeBoer, are really captivating together. Patrick is a stalwart man of action who's dedicated to getting out of here to rejoin the fight come hell or high water, and trying to keep even the tiniest bit of hope alive for his new companion. Meanwhile, DeBoer's character is much younger, but also much more familiar with how callous and cruel these aliens can really be to their prisoners, having apparently already watched a previous cellmate die from their tortures, and now having to watch and feel her own body changing more and more every day. Their interactions throughout the story build a believable bond between the two characters, but they also do a lot to make the entirely off-screen state of Earth, the war, and the toll it's all taken on humanity and each of them personally still feel convincingly lived in and real. Sometimes engagingly written and sincerely performed ruminations on the effects of a war can make just as strong of an impression as actually showing any of the larger scale war itself. The small-scale, intimate, less is more story, the simple but palpably atmospheric setting, the memorable body horror with a ticking clock attached to it, the pair of stellar performances, and the ever-increasing sense of dread, desperation, and bleakness that builds to one of the most unforgettable gut-punch endings in the entire series. It all just works so damn well, and it's one of those stories that's even more interesting on a rewatch. Quality of Mercy is not only a fan favorite, it's the fan favorite for many, and it's easy to see why. Number 1. A Stitch in Time. Of course, the last episode on the list would happen to have one last Star Trek actor in it. Michelle Forbes, aka the original Bajoran character, Ensign Ro, plays an FBI agent investigating a mysterious series of murders committed across several decades, with seemingly nothing connecting them, except all of the victims were killed with the same gun, and some were somehow killed years before the gun was ever made. These murders were in fact committed by a genius scientist played by Amanda Plummer. She's invented a time machine that she uses to go back and kill serial killers at a point in their lives just before they killed their first victims. She knows from present-day history that they will take numerous innocent lives and will be captured, convicted, and ultimately sentenced to death. So her reasoning is that she's just carrying out executions that would have happened years or decades later anyway. But doing it her way also saves all of these men's victims like the killings never happened. Because now they didn't. And we see the cause and effect ripples of her changing the past, altering present-day reality several times. Forbes tracks down and questions the scientist thanks to fingerprints that were found at the scene of one of the murders, which occurred when the scientist was still a child. To Forbes, it's just a bizarre stretch of a lead and probably just some paperwork mix-up, but to our time-traveling killer, it's a loose end that's led an FBI agent way too close to her. So she goes back again to clean up the prints. And just like that, the present changes, and now Forbes is back to never having met or heard of her. Later in the episode, the man who killed Forbes's best friend, among many other victims, is executed in the present, and that's the scientist's cue to do her thing, go back in time and perform her brand of execution on the killer's younger self. Just like that, the present changes again, and now Forbes's friend is still alive and well. Eventually, a new lead brings the agent face to face with the scientist again, just as she takes one final jump back in time. She's finally going to change the event in her own life that set her on this bloody path in the first place. As a teenager, she was kidnapped, beaten, and, well, I'm sure you can guess, for several days, and that experience has both tormented and fiercely driven her ever since. She invented time travel so she could save as many women as she could from being victimized like she was, and in the end, face her own victimizer and spare her younger self the forever scarred life she had to live. Can Agent Forbes stop this final murder? And perhaps more importantly and troublingly, should it be stopped? If something revolutionary like time travel, or the precogs, or the Sybil system, or whatever, comes along and provides a sense of certainty that a person will commit a violent crime, is it right to punish them before they've actually committed or even attempted that crime? It's a fascinating quandary. Is Plummer's character really right to kill a killer before they ever killed anybody, if it means undoing murders that their future selves have already committed in her time? She is killing people at points in time when they're technically still innocents, and killing them in cold blood makes them victims now and her a serial killer. Do the ends justify the means? Is murder still just murder, no matter who it's committed against, or where, how, why, and when it's committed? What would you do if you had the power to go back in time and undo some of the wrongs of the past, and how far would you be willing to go to do it, especially if it was personal? I love how this story raises all of these questions while never firmly picking a definitive side. The main characters make their own choices about it for their own understandable reasons, but final judgment about whether they're right or not is left for the audience to decide for themselves. That moral ambiguity really makes the ending stick with you as much more sophisticated and challenging than most other episodes. The sheer power of Amanda Plummer's Emmy-winning performance here always commands your attention, sympathy, and even fear. Her expressions and deliveries really make you feel the years of psychological and emotional trauma, the rage at the injustice of what happened to her and continues to happen to innocents every day, and even sorrow, knowing somewhere deep down that all of this was ultimately a futile quest for some personal sense of revenge and closure. It is a raw, chilling, just bravura performance. A Stitch in Time has just about everything you could want from a top-tier Outer Limits episode. A smart, gripping plot, excellent performances, and a fantastical sci-fi element that works in service of a story that's dark, emotional, thought-provoking, and all too grounded in the human condition. It's a gem of the 1995 Outer Limits series, and it's hands down my personal #1 favorite episode. Well, that's my list of favorite stories from the show that first introduced me to the wonderful world of anthology TV shows. The gateway that led me to The Twilight Zone, Tales from the Dark Side, Tales from the Crypt, the original 1960s Outer Limits, and many other great shows I would come to love over the years. I can't speak for how much people who watched the original Outer Limits would like the 95 show, but I think if nothing else, they're both very much of their respective times. In some ways for better, and in some ways for worse. Whichever version one might personally prefer to watch, it's awesome how both had the same kind of effect on whole different generations of young budding sci-fi fans, capturing our imaginations and inspiring us to explore a wider variety of sci-fi film, TV, and literature as we grew up. To my dear 1995 Outer Limits, happy 30th anniversary, and thank you for the impact you had on my life. And to my dear viewers, happy Halloween, thank you for watching, please like, subscribe, etc. if you are so inclined, and until next time, glory to fankind.